Michelle Caruso-Cabrera walked him through there a number of the recent news items and got him to make a number of headlines here. I think the first one is that Steve Bannon thinks the president's performance in Helsinki was fine, and he says that that's a weak word, and he says that he didn't have the command performance that he had in Singapore. I think that will be a comment that will be remarked upon widely, and I think he also said that the president gravitates toward people who have strong personalities in terms of President Xi, President Putin, Erdogan in Turkey, but Bannon says he's fine with that because ultimately the president is leading here from a position of strength. I think that'll be a widely remarked upon comment. He also said that the meddling did happen in the U.S. election by Russia back in 2016, but he said the meddling was on the margins. That is, that the president, it appeared to be, the president was suggesting, Steve Bannon was suggesting the president should take the approach that there was Russian interference in the U.S. election, but it wasn't determinative. It didn't make the difference overall in the election, and Bannon seemed to not quite understand why the president can't separate those two things. He conflates those two things. And then finally, he addressed the trade issues right now, and he said, we are at war with China. And he referred repeatedly to the trade war. And you hear White House officials here on this complex trying to go out of their way extensively to avoid suggesting that we're at a trade war. They say it's a conflict, it's a dispute, it's something that could be resolved in a short term. Bannon's putting this in a multi-generational context here and suggesting that the rules-based international order de-industrialized the United States, particularly the upper Midwest. And he says we are in a trade war with China and that we've been in one kind of war or another with China for a long time now. Those are provocative comments.
Yeah, I mean, say what you will, Jimmy P., about Steve Bannon, and trust me, we're getting a lot of commentary pouring in, whether you agree with him or hate him. I mean, this is clearly a man that is familiar with the president's thinking, especially as it relates to trade. So when he says things like we're going to see a complete reorientation of supply chain around the freedom-loving countries, is that realistic?
Is Russia one of those freedom-loving countries? I think he included Russia as part of his sort of civilizational war against China. I don't consider Russia a liberal democracy or technically part of the West. Apparently he does, which may say how he values liberal democracy. But I'm interested in is, does the president really share his view of what this trade war, whatever he wants to call it, against China? He focused a lot on the technology. When I hear the president talk, he mostly talks about the trade deficit. China should buy more stuff. Occasionally, he'll mention like the tech aspect.
Larry Kudlow talked about it.
I don't know if he buys that. I don't know if he buys the Bannon. We're in a war for genetic engineering and nanotechnology supremacy.
Sarah, what's your take on that? Was there some sense in any of what we heard from Steve Bannon there?
Oh, I think, look, he does know the president very well. He's familiar with his thinking. He's influential on the president. I suspect the president will pay attention to what he says. But, what I do think Steve is right is, and I don't agree with President Trump's approach on this, but you do have to give President Trump some credit for moving these NATO countries to spend more on their own defense. I wouldn't call it a protectorate. It's a partnership. But he's right. Our European allies do need to do more. And I do think Trump is, again, his approach is off, but his approach is at least effective in getting them to spend more money.
So, Dan, let's get to the investor takeaway from all of this. Michelle asked, what is winning? Because he says the U.S. is going to win this trade war. And Steve Bannon said full access to their markets. What kind of bumps along the way, if we even get there? I mean, how much pain is the market and the global economy going to have to endure to get to that prize if we even get there?
Sure. And I saw a lot of similarities between what Steve was saying and Larry Kudlow today. They just have very different ways of saying it. And if you take those two remarks, the two speakers today from your conference, Larry was saying Trump needs a win on NAFTA, possibly EU autos, because we're going to focus on China. And what Steve Bannon just said is, put yourself in a seatbelt, lock yourself in. This is going to be a long process. It's not going to be short run. And it is akin to the buildup of the Soviet Union with Reagan fighting the Cold War. It's just going to be with China on trade policy rather than defense spending. And so from an investor takeaway, getting a win on the EU or NAFTA for Trump will be important. Investors have given Trump a pretty big leash on China because there is no timeline or deadline, and let the process play out. And Sarah, I think what Steve was saying is a win is two different parts of this. Number one, tariffs in China right now are about 9%. If you can get them down to the rest of the developed world at 3%, there will be better market access. And two, to stop stealing the intellectual property of the United States. If you get those two, that defines a victory, but it's not going to be easy to get there.
Yeah, someone should also comment on the deep immorality of Bannon's dystopian alternate reality, where China is forever poor. Is that what he thinks? That we should have kept China forever making $2 a day forever? Because that's basically where he's going.
This is an excellent point. My former boss, President Bush, used to talk about, we're trying to create several 100,000 jobs a month in this country. They need to create millions of jobs a month. And that's what their leaders worry about, is job creation as people move into these cities. And Steve Bannon completely, as Jimmy pointed out, avoided the need for them to educate and employ their people.
Yeah. Listen, I'm okay. Go ahead.
Eamon, final word, because we're going to have to leave it there.
Sure, yeah. I just think that one of the things that Steve Bannon said there toward the end was maybe one of the most important things that we heard him say, and not something that they say here at the White House. He said, tariffs are not just about economics, they're about identity and self-worth. And he tied the tariffs right to the opioid crisis that's hurt so much of this country. When the White House officials now, currently, talk about the tariffs, they don't talk about it in that language. They talk about it as a negotiating tactic. They talk about it in terms of economics. He's saying this isn't about economics at all. What the president's doing here is about identity. And I think that's powerful, and it explains a lot of this White House's approach, even though White House officials don't stand here necessarily on the North Lawn and say that on national television.
Well, it's also sort of the Bannon spin. Final question, Dan Clifton, are you going to be joining this administration? We've reported that you are having talks with Larry Kudlow.
We could leave the interview there. As of right now, I work for Strategas.
I will command the Space Force.
That's a no comment.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.